be the highest frequency of draws and the least error in people's ranges. There's gonna be so many draws that draw domination becomes very important because a dominated draw is in pretty bad shape equity-wise usually. C-betting or leading with air is usually not a great idea simply because of what was already been said. This is especially true out of position or in multi-way pots, and this is obviously because when you're out of position it's easier for your opponents to float you and play back at you, and you're gonna have to give them more information on air streets, and when on a board like this you're just not gonna get enough folds on the flop or on future streets for you to be profitably barreling with air or stuff like that. So yeah, these are the boards you definitely want to be betting less on, but when you do bet, your range is going to be on the stronger side for the same reason. So bigger bet sizing usually will make sense against most opponents on these boards. Alright, so these are the same simulations I have been running all throughout the series. How often does an opponent with a 35% pre-flop range have a hand versus hand equity of at least 30%? So on a very wet board like Jack 10-4 suited, these are the results versus just bare aces at 35% pre-flop range. Will have a hand of at least 30% equity 71% of the time. So realizing that in a three-way pot with just bare aces on this board, say like ace 5-7, then you should probably strongly consider just check folding, especially against competent opponents or against competent ranges, decent ranges. Interestingly, it doesn't really change that much versus a Jack 10 type of hand, although obviously 10% is definitely different, but it's still a pretty high percentage of the time. And this is obviously just in a heads up pot. Even versus top set, 40% of the time or close to that, someone's gonna have 30% equity. So it just kind of show you how on these wet boards there's just so many draws available that even top set is kind of a draw in itself, in that it's looking for a brick turn and possibly a brick river in order to keep being a hand that's capable of being value bet or whatever. That doesn't lose its value as the hand goes on. Interestingly, also I found that versus a hand like an overpair with a nut flush draw, that's the lowest percentage of the time 35 per flop range is gonna have a hand with at least 30% equity. So this kind of shows how having a dominating draw, not draw, with like an overpair is just so powerful on these boards, and your opponents are gonna have a hard time having hands that do well in equity against you. Alright, so the second example is just a much lighter board like deuce 6-7 that people miss more often. So we can see versus aces, people are gonna be missing the board more often. On this board also top two pair is even more vulnerable than on the last one, and that just reflects a bit in the it went from 61 to 54%, which is kind of the same for aces, so that's sort of interesting. Now a hand like an overpair with the nut flush draw, queens with the nut flush draw, then the percentage goes down to 43, and all the way down there we have a stronger overpair with a nut open in the straight draw, and with a monster like that, then it's gonna be very rare for your opponents to have at least 30% equity against your hand, and I think most of them are actually the nut flush draw with something else to go with it, because on these boards people are not gonna have sets that often. Um, yeah, and so actually, if that king's hand were aces, 8-9 with a nut flush draw, then the 26% would go down to, I think, around 10 or so. So that's pretty crazy how obviously aces ace is the nut flush draw and 8-9 is a huge monster there, but yeah. Alright, so specifically on heavy wet boards, these are the boards that are gonna be like two broadways and two tone. So there's a few examples. People will hit this board pretty hard very often, so stacks are usually gonna go in on the flop when the SPR is like, you know, lower than 6 or whatever. And when it gets a bit higher, there's, I guess, a little bit more floating involved because people are gonna be aware that draw domination is dangerous, so many people decide to play their medium or weak draws just more passively and stuff. Um, but anyway, whenever stacks off occur, the equities will be usually in the 60-40s because it's gonna be like top two pair against like a wrap and a flush draw or whatever. Although having 70% or more equity is definitely not gonna be uncommon if there's draw domination involved in the hand matchups. So yeah. Here's something else I saw on Pro Poker Tools. 35% range will have a good mate hand or draw on Ace Jack 8 suited, which is a heavy wet board, around 20% of the time. And I did that by running the halved, and does 35% have a hand that's in this range with, you know, sets and top two pair and some wrap plus flush draw type hands. You know, this is just a pretty rough estimate. I'm definitely not sure how I mean, you could probably move around a bunch of hands and include some other hands in here. You know, even just like Queen 10 with a flush draw is obviously a strong hand, a double gutter and a flush draw. So anyways, it's probably higher, a bit higher than 20%. And obviously there's a bunch of more hands that are just like a nut gutter with the flush draw that are still, you know, not that not that strong, but not weak at all. So anyway, this is just like a really strong range, and it's still 20% of the time, which is pretty often. It will only have air or whatever Pro Poker Tools acknowledges as nothing only 11% of the time. I think this is just like no pair, and yeah, basically. And just to contrast that, on one of the first boards we analyzed, King 5 Deuce Rainbow, he will have nothing according to PPT 20%, 27% of the time. So whatever nothing means, it's almost, you know, 3 times more likely on a board like King 5 Deuce than Ace Jack 8 suited. Alright, so I grouped average and lightweight boards because there's just not much difference, and I don't want to be as repetitive because we have, I think, some interesting hands to look at. Basically, here are some examples. The main gist is the lower frequency of sets and top two pair as always. So there's also a higher frequency of pair plus draw type hands. So on the average wet boards, you know, top pair with a good flush draw is gonna be a decently strong hand. Usually, I mean, definitely strong enough to stack off in low SPR situations or some mid SPR situations. While on the light wet boards, you know, top pair plus decent flush draw is not gonna cut it anymore because there's just much more overpairs plus not flush draw type hands and stuff that just crush. You know, if you get it in with jacks with a flush draw against kings with a higher flush draw, then you're usually not in good shape, unless your sidecars are really helping. Um, Semi-bluffing is usually going to be based on straight up equity and not fold equity, because people are not going to be missing these boards a lot and not betting these boards a lot with air anyway. So yeah, stack ups usually occur because people are, falling back on their equity. Um, Especially in multi-way pots, this is true. In some heads-up pots, I think there's still room, especially if the SPR is not that low. There's still room to make a small semi-bluff raise or semi-bluff light on boards, especially like on 863 that he's just not gonna hit as often, and he might not even have hands to fight back as often anyway. Um, yeah, so on these boards you can maybe semi-bluff light heads up and still get away with it, but in multi-way pots and low SPR situations, it's just much more common, much more often people are going to be able to stack off and fight against semi-bluffing, so I wouldn't really recommend it. Um, that actually reminds me of something Phil Galfond once said. I think he made a semi-bluff raise with what was basically air on a board like King Jack 8 suited, which is obviously very heavy and wet. And he said against regulars, he sometimes does this type of semi-bluff races because they really expect it on a board like 863, and so they're actually gonna fight lighter. They're gonna fight back lighter on these light wet boards than on a board like King Jack 8, where they're not really expecting, Galfond to raise that light, and so they might even make tight folds with like top pair and not gutter or whatever. Um, so I thought that was pretty interesting, and it actually makes sense if people are definitely aware of draw domination on King 9-7, then King Jack 7 two-tone, then they're probably not gonna fight back as often if they think you're just not semi-bluffing with air often enough. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff as always from Phil. Alright, so a bit more Pro Poker Tool simulations before we go on to the hands. So I was curious about the nut flush draw, since it's just so important on these types of boards and such a powerful hand in PLO. I was wondering about the frequencies. So on a board like 2-6-7 two-tone, the question was how many players with a hand how many players are gonna have the nut flush draw. And the answer goes with one 35% range, 8.6%, and it basically doubles and triples with 2 or 3 people in the pot. Then the last difference I made is if I tighten up everyone's range is just a bit, not just a bit, from 35 to 20, then this not the chance that someone is gonna have a flush draw in a 3-way pot is almost 1/3. So, that's probably something to think about, as, a bunch of hands that you might think are good. Just like a pair over pairs on this board, if someone like check raises you and stuff, then it's definitely really likely they're gonna be holding the nut flush draw. And so if you have a non-nut flush draw or just like a pair over pair, and you're not really doing that great, so it would depend obviously on the SPR, but it's just not that uncommon to have the nut flush draw. It's basically what I'm trying to say, especially in a multi-way pot. If people are playing, decent ranges. The second question is, so I guess the nut flusher is one of the strongest draws, so now I wanted to see how often people actually had strong May hands, which, as we know by definition on light boards, is not going to be that often. So here are the results, and you can see actually here there is another difference between the 35% and 20% ranges. It actually goes down because, tighter ranges are not going to be having, this really marginal or low pocket pairs in them as often. So now if we see it, side by side, then if you get check raised by a 20% range on a board like deuce 6-7 suited, then it's twice as likely he has the nut flush draw with something to go with it than a set or two pair type of hand, which is definitely important if you're thinking or if you're making a decision with like jacks on a flush draw and a jack high flush draw. Then you're doing you're definitely doing not that bad against this hand, but against a hand like ace king with the nut flush draw, you're flipping, and aces with the nut flush draw or kings with the second nut flush draw, you're pretty crushed. So against a tight range, you should be worried about draw domination in those situations. Alright, so I changed the board a bit for this last question. Instead of using this deuce 6-7 light board, I used an average board, queen, or kind of heavy average, I guess. Queen 9-7 two-tone, and I asked the same question about sets and two pairs, and obviously since it's not such a light board and people are going to be playing these pocket pairs more often, then this it's almost double or whatever. These are the results, and with 20% ranges it goes up to 36. So this answer should be the same with the nut flush draw on this board. So now in a three-way pot with 35 or 20% ranges, you can see here how often they're gonna be check raising or whatever with the nut flush draw, and it's somewhat comparable to some of these sets or two pairs. So on a board like queen of spades, nine of spades, seven diamonds, you should probably feel better with like the jack high flush draw than on a board like 2-6-7 if a tight opponent is giving you action, because it's gonna be a little bit more likely he has sets and two pair type hands. So if you have like jack 10-8 with the jack high flush draw, you might not be as dominated as often. Obviously, you much rather have the king high flush draw. But yeah, with the king high flush draw, you should feel, pretty, I mean, not pretty safe because it's still pretty likely they have the nut flush, but you should be more willing to stack off and not be as worried about domination. Alright, so the next question I asked, I was trying to analyze a hand like queens with a flush draw on this board. I think it's kind of an interesting hand. It's interesting because it's against like a bare nut flush draw. I think this equity I ran that's on the bottom, sorry, it's not in order, that's on the bottom is kind of the equivalent of just running like this hand versus ace of spades with another spade card. So it's around 33-35% equity. So yeah, queens with queen high flush draw is gonna be like 35% equity against the nut flush draw. However, it's in really bad shape against two specific hands, the aces and nut flush draw and kings with the king high flush draw. So I wanted to run just out of curiosity's sake, how often is that gonna actually happen on a board like deuce 9-7 when we hold queens with the queen high flush draw, and I got these results. So a player that's three betting a 5% range out of the big blind, say he squeezes pre-flop and he's just tight, he's actually gonna have aces or kings with the king high flush draw 16% of the time on a board like this. So I think that's pretty high actually, but it does make sense obviously with this range. But yeah, so against an opponent like that, if he pots it post flop like into three players and you're holding this hand, it's probably a close decision. You're either gonna be flipping, or as you can see here in this second simulation, against those two specific hands you're gonna have like 10% equity, which is really bad. So if he pots it in a four-way pot, like he wouldn't pot bare aces on 297 two-tone, unless the SPR is really low. But you know, if the SPR is like 6 and he pots it, you know, you might be able to fold, especially if you still got people behind you. Anyway, a 10% range is only 10%, and up to a 25% range, he's only gonna have these monsters like 4.5% of the time, which is great. You know, against someone that's 3-betting pretty wide, or maybe in a heads-up pot, then you should definitely feel pretty good about your hand on this flop. And there's just a much higher chance you're actually gonna dominate his hand. If we get it in on this flop against a 25% range, then he's definitely gonna have more jack and 9 high flush draws with, you know, some wraps or maybe stuff like that. Then, you know, these monsters, or we're at least gonna be flipping, or, you know, have decent equity against the bare nut flush draw and not just crushed. Yeah, so this one was just another simulation against the nut flush draw, but without aces, kings, or queens, so we still only have 40% equity. But yeah, alright. So now we're gonna take a look at some hands, so be right back. Hey, so first hand, we have a pretty good hand on the cutoff. We open, get 2 callers. The flop is kind of a close decision between c-betting and checking, probably planning to check call and then like check raise a bunch of turns where we improve. I think with these 2 players though, I think I kind of favor betting, just because Akbal seems to fold to c-bets a lot and this guy doesn't, so if I get him to fold I can buy position, and then I can just get in on a bunch of turns against this big guy if he check calls. If we check raises, it's kind of a close decision. I might be able to find a fold, but I don't know. I had to run a simulation. It's probably pretty close because I only need like 33% to call. Anyway, they both call. Turn is an ace, and this guy checks. So I have a few options here. I can bet 14. I can bet 14 or something close to that, and have Vigo shove and reopen the action, so I can shove and end the hand right there. Without having to play the river. Sadly, that just won't happen most of the time. He will just call for $14. So I don't really like that option. I can check, and the main advantage of checking is that I basically misrepresent my range to Ahbal, and that might induce him to bet, and you know, he's probably gonna acknowledge whatever his calling range is, probably, you know, a lot of kings and stuff like that. He's probably gonna acknowledge his range is, you know, ahead of Vigo, or he might have fold equity against Vigo anyhow. And he's probably gonna expect me just to be check folding a lot of the time, because if I had a strong hand, I would definitely barrel for protection very often. So yeah, the benefit is if I get him to bet, then I can check jam and not play the river and not make any mistakes out of position. So yeah, the third option is obviously to bet, and that's definitely my standard, especially with a passive opponent behind me. I just want to get value and, you know, protection. The only bad thing is if he calls, he might be doing so with enough equity anyway, and the river SPR is going to be like 1, and I'm usually going to have a bluff catcher on, you know, just a bunch of cards, most of the deck. And that's obviously not a good situation for me if he uses his position on the river to bluff me off my hand or value bet me. So yeah, in this hand I decided to check, simply because Afbal I think will bet more often than the average player, and so I ran good in head in that he decided to bet, and I checked ship, and I was actually surprised he ended up folding. I think he actually about it for a bit, so he might have made a good fold with a hand which is like 25% equity, like you know, maybe king queen with a flush draw or something. So I guess nice fold there. But yeah, you know, this is still a good result for me. I got money off him, and you know, first of all, never showed my hand. Second, obviously he forfeited some equity in the pot, and third of all, I did not bet, have him call, which is what he probably would have done with a hand. You know, with the hands he's gonna be bet folding. I think he would have at least called the turn and played, you know, decently on the river, at least with an SPR that favored him. So next hand, I open under the gun with this double suited hand. I think it's fine. Yeah, I think it's fine. I get 3-bet and a call, so I just call here. It's actually gonna be a pretty decent spot with these stack sizes. The SPR is 4, and with this hand you just flop a ton and are able to check raise very often. Not great that this guy doesn't really raise ever or 3-bet ever, so I don't know if he's gonna be c-betting as light on these boards, or if he's just gonna check back with his range, you know, like his bare aces and stuff. So after this guy checked, I decided just to lead because I definitely do not want him to check back. And if he happens to bet like 20 and I guess, or 25, and I check ship, he might even fold, you know, a hand that he might call to streets with if I lead. So the main reason is still I just don't want to give them a free card, and I want to build a pot now. And if they want to get it in, I'm definitely gonna be happy to do so. So that's an easy turn, but let's go back and talk about what my turn plan is. I'm gonna have 140 behind and 90 in the pot, so SPR of 1.4 or something. SPR of 1.5. On a deuce 3, 4, 5, I'm probably just gonna ship it. I think on a 6, I might also ship it. I basically don't want to give this guy a free card, and I don't think he's gonna stab that light on the turn, especially with that SPR. So I'm probably just gonna take the lead on most situations and just make sure we get the money in. And you know, if he somehow outdrew me, then I mean, that's fine. I should have at least, you know, 25-30% equity. So yeah, on anything up to an 8, up to a 6, I think I'm just up to a 5. I'm just shoving. 6 is kind of close. Well, I do pick up the open-ended, so yeah, I think I'm shoving also. 7 is kind of awkward. I think I'm at least barreling. I'm not gonna be shoving though, probably. The 8 is probably it's not. The 8 is probably one of the worst cards, I guess. Just because, you know, still a flighting range, I do expect him to have some draws, and if he does 3-bet 3.1%, then it might be that he flats some of the weakest aces and 3-bet some kind of rundown. So especially after he calls the flop with a player behind him, I do sometimes expect him to have like 8, 10 jack type hands, or just like 10 jack queen bear type hands. So yeah, definitely an 8 is probably not great, and I might check fold if he just like pots it, or I might check call if he bets smaller and stuff. Definitely probably gonna check the side. And I think the same goes for like a 10 and the jack. Yeah. And on an ace, it's not that great of a card, but I don't see how I can just check fold on an ace. You know, with him having these straight draws, and I don't think however, don't think he's gonna shove the turn on an ace with just a bare wrap. He probably just checks behind. somewhat often. So I don't know, on an ace it might be a check fold, it might be just a pot on my for me. Yeah. Anyway, I hit the 9. So on board pairing cards like a king, 9 or 7, I will definitely barrel, but I don't think there's much reason in putting it. I could just bet small, which is what I would do with the rest of my leading range. About the rest of my leading range, I'm not gonna be leading air ever on this flop in a three-way pot, obviously. Um, Probably not even gonna be leading like a bear wrap type hand. I'd rather just check call or check and then fold if this guy bets and this guy shoves. So yeah, I'm gonna be leading sets, two pairs, good good combo hands like the one I have, a wrap with a flush draw to go with it. I'm also gonna be leading not flush draw with something to go with, which is almost, when I have the not flush draw here after racing under the gun, I'm definitely gonna have something to go with it on this flop. So those are the type of hands I'm gonna be leading, and with all of my range, I'm gonna be barreling this turn, just expecting him to fold the weakest of his draws, and obviously getting value with when I do have the boat. I just don't see why we, should bet that big and kind of leave some room on the river for barreling or draws. Um, if we think he's gonna be folding the river, which in this hand it's an easy shove, and he calls with spare aces. I don't know. I think he should just fold the. I mean, he should just fold the flop, even though his aces were, awesome pre-flop. This is just not a board he wants to be calling a lead on, especially with someone behind him that might still, check raise. So I don't know. I think folding the flop is not that bad, especially if he knows I'm just not leading that light on this board. He's just not doing good against my range, and he doesn't even have that many, good turn cards. I mean, diamonds are great for him, but even then, he still wasn't gonna be in that great of a shape. And just with that guy behind him, I think it's a fold. He might have called because I didn't bet so big. And I should probably just bet bigger, honestly, on this board. Consider my range is just usually not bet folding, and if I do play the turn out of position, it'd probably be better for me the closer the SPR is to 1, so I can just shove most turns and not make bigger mistakes. So yeah, after I bet the flop, the turn is kind of close for him with my sizing, but I think the river, I don't know if I'm just bluffing here with my misdraws that often against him, specifically considering his 3-betting range and that he called the turn already. But the 6 also brings in others, some of my straight draws. So I don't know. I think he should fold at some point in the hand, and that's a form of tilt I see some people do, that their hands are so good pre-flop that they just have so much trouble letting them go post-flop, which they just kind of get blinded by the pre-flop beauty of their hand. So this hand I open from the bottom, standard, get one color, with someone that has a decent range, probably for flatting the, well, not as decent, but for flatting the small line might not be as wide. And he basically pots it into me on 2-6-7, which is one of the boards we saw. So I have a not flush draw and not gutter. Definitely not doing that bad against most hands. Not doing that great against a few hands, namely, sets, but still, never crushed. So yeah, I decided to just raise it here, and my rule of thumb is, yeah, usually just, I like to set my bluff raise when I have the not flush draw with some backdoor backup to go with it. in this case the nut gutter. That said, I should maybe pay more attention to just the specific components, and I was probably just multi-tabling here and just decided to raise it. But when this guy pots it into me, with his stack sizes, specifically because he's shorter, I don't think he's gonna be lead folding as often. And against I get any range, I'm doing fine. I'm flipping, but it's gonna be hard for me to make mistakes with my hand on the turn and the river, especially in position, and because it's just knotted. Like I don't make any non-knot hands, except I guess if I pair up with an ace or something. But anyway, I think there might be just more value to flatting and then trying to outplay him on board on cards that change the board texture, and I might even get more value for my hands this way than just pushing a small equity edge on the flop, or get it in with 35% equity against the third or whatever, which is definitely not ideal. I mean, if his range is not that weak for leading the flop, then I'm just making it easier for him to play his hand out of position and just get the money in without having to play the turn and the river. So yeah, I don't necessarily like my race here, although I'm never in bad shape, in that bad shape. And he got it in with queens with open-ended, which I think is fine. It's fine, but if I do start tightening up my flop raising range, then I'm gonna have more hands that have him in trouble. So, with his hand, I mean, it's a fine way to play it, especially if it's gonna get me to raise. Then it's just easier for him to get it in on the flop. Because with his specific hand, he really doesn't have that much visibility on the turn and the river. So yeah, I just made it easier for him. So yeah, the 7 might have been a card I would have been able to bluff. Maybe for 2 streets, if he checks the turn there. And I just lost the hand, but whatever. Yeah, the main point is that think about if it might be better to float in some situations. If he's lead folding the flop, then I think raising has much more merit. Or if he was, c-betting, he's a white c-better, then I'm also gonna be check raising myself. And if I'm gonna be out of position, then I don't mind check raising, but in position, it might be better to just play the hand and take advantage of your positional advantage. Alright, so next hand, this guy raises from the small blind, and this is a hand I will usually 3-bet, except this guy opens 10%. So from the small blind I thought he would be pretty tight, and not really that excited about getting 4-bet, although it's not that bad. However, his range is probably gonna have my suits dominated, some of the time, so it's not that great either. Anyway, I decided to just call and play in position. He c-bets and barrels a ton, so this is a fine hand to just float the flop with. I don't see racing being a good option here. Obviously, if he comes over the top, we're gonna be crushed. So yeah, it's just don't race, and definitely folding would be too weak, so just call. Turn isn't that great 'cause he's not gonna slow him down at all, but he actually just bets $10 into 15, which is definitely good for me. I would rather call this sizing than a pot bet. River's a queen, and he checks, so I feel good about my hand, and I think we just need to value bet here. I actually bet 20, but talking about this hand over which way, I think betting the river just bigger would be better. This guy probably doesn't have that many reads on me. And if I'm just betting my missed draws or my trips type of hands, then he's probably just check calling with aces and kings. So it doesn't really make that much of a difference how much I bet. His calling range is inelastic. So yeah, it only hurts if he has king queen or ace queen, which is definitely likely. I'm not sure if he value bets those on the river or turns them into bluff catchers. But yeah, I think betting bigger on the river would have been better. So he calls with kings, and we see that we would have probably gotten 4-bet, and on this flop would have probably gotten it in with 31% equity, which is not an ideal situation for us in any way. As is, I called twice, having basically enough pot odds to call, with obviously some implied odds as we saw, and probably not much reverse implied odds, as I don't think I was gonna call a bet on a river heart, and yeah. So I think I was gonna get to showdown whenever I improved on the river a lot, and yeah, I guess it's not that interesting hand. Just definitely wanted to point out that you don't have to 3-bet pre-flop against such tight range, and the flop would never be a good racing spot. Alright, next hand I have queens. I raise a limper, and this guy flats. Worth noticing, he doesn't seem to be 3-betting at all, but I think if he still had aces, he would probably 3-bet because he's shorter, and I did ISO raise, so he could probably just 3-bet to a decent amount now. But it's still possible he still has aces or definitely kings in his range. Flop is 7-9 deuce. We have a backdoor flush draw otherwise, and not gutter, and on weak overpair, but it's not that great of a hand. This guy decides to lead, and this is the other guy folds. So this is a close decision. I think a guy that against an opponent that doesn't really lead much, this might just be a straight out fold. We're really not doing that well against his leading range, even if it's mainly composed of draws and stuff, because I really don't expect calling range, although this guy's pretty wide, to be calling with a set of 9s and 7s and then leading this size, leading for this size. So against someone that potted it or has a tight dunk leading range, then I think this might just be a fold. This guy actually, you can't see, but he dunk bet like 20% of the time, so he was being active dunk leading. So for that reason, I definitely think he has a bunch of draws. That said, I still obviously don't want to get it in on the flop, just because even his draws have me in bad shape, but I do think I can continue with my hand, especially for this bet sizing. And I'm basically hoping he doesn't have aces or kings with a flush draw, and so I'm not crushed, and I'm hoping he barrels light, interpreting my flat call as just a weak hand. I mean, it is a weak hand, but it can get better on a bunch of turn cards. So my plan is to flat the flop and then get it in on a deuce, 3 or 4, 5 is kind of close. I might have to just fold on a 5. If he pots it, a 6 also might have to fold on. An 8 is kind of tricky, because a lot of his leading range I do expect him to have Jack 10. So yeah, I think I'm just gonna fold on a 6, 8, 10, and Jack, and on diamonds if he keeps barreling, simply because those are first of all the hands that he's probably gonna be leading with, a bunch of draws that interact with those turn cards, and second of all, those are also the hands that I'm raping by flat calling the flop. So if he keeps barreling on those cards, then you know, he shouldn't be expecting me to fold that often, so I'm definitely gonna fold this part of my range. While the other part of my range I'm calling with on this flop, like bear 8-10 jack, is obviously gonna be able to continue on those trade cards. So yeah, I'm probably gonna fold those. The queen is obviously awesome. And the ace and the king, if he barrels, I'm probably just gonna have to fold. You know, he might be bluffing me off on those cards, but he still might have, you know, a king high flush draw or a queen high flush draw very often. And there's still a part of my range that's gonna be able to continue on those cards. It's just not this part. If the turn is a heart, then I'm definitely usually gonna be able to continue more easily. So that's my plan, and still I'm basically praying he doesn't have kings or aces. So turn is a deuce, and he does barrel, and I expect him to barrel this card just much more often than you know, other cards, just because I'm basically repping a bunch of draws, and he is gonna just barrel with everything. So the good thing also is now I bid 9-7, which I guess was a part of his range. So yeah, I just decided to get it in here. I don't really want to call and play for another $36 on the river. I just want to get it in now. If I'm right about him not having, you know, a set or kings or aces, then I'm good. And he's still gonna call with, he's still committed with a bunch of his draws, and if I'm wrong, then whatever. I guess I'm just ran bad because he's definitely leading our wide range on the flop. So yeah, we get it in against this hand, and we have 60% equity or 58, and fortunately we win. But want to show the flop equity also, and you know, we're in great shape. We had enough equity to call, and you know, I think our turn plan was good. So yeah, I think it was an interesting hand, and I played it fine, and obviously I ran good with the turn card and his specific holding, but against his white flop leading range, I think it's a close decision with this hand, and so I think worse than this hand, you should probably lean more towards a fold on the flop. But this might be good enough against his range. Next hand, this is kind of a short one. I open from early position. I think it's fine. It's probably a bad table, except for this guy. I got to my mirror right. But anyway, I hit this flop, and I just wanted to point out how this is a flop that I might be check folding some of the time with a decent part of my MP opening range. So for that same reason, I might decide to go for a check raise some of the time. Now I don't really want to check raise someone that's as deep as me, or even 100 bs deep. I mean, 100 bs deep is probably not that bad. If he might even commit with worse. But you know, as you get deeper, you start running into the nut flush draw more often, and just not really doing that well with this hand. So specifically because this guy is short, and therefore he might interpret my check just as an honest give up, as I don't want to bet, and he has a really nice shoving stack size with a bunch of his semi draws. So actually, if he's semi shoving, if he's shoving a lot versus a c-bet, then I should have just c-bet and hope he shove and get it in with this hand. But anyway, I decided to just check, and since some of the hands that I might check this flop with would definitely improve on a lot of turns, like let's say ace queen jack 9 with diamonds. That just benefits a lot from seeing a free turn, so I might want to see a free turn with those cards. So I decided to go for a check raise here, and I do get him to put, you know, a bit of money in the pot which you know should have been something close to air or something like that, or a hand that at least had some equity anyway. So regardless, I get him to forfeit some equity and make myself more difficult to play against, and make myself more likely to get some free turns some time when I check, and him not being able to just tap blindly at these pots. So, on these wet boards, what I'm trying to say is, as you're gonna be check folding a lot of your hands, so a bunch of your air, then you should definitely take advantage of that, and I guess not let your opponents exploit you as much by having a decent check raising range. And hands like this with bottom pair and a decent flush draw are the type of hands you don't mind getting in, and they can help you build your check raising range very easily, because you're just not often gonna have a set or two pair here, obviously. Alright, so this hand, it's an easy 3-bet preflop, even against this guy. He doesn't really open that much, but I think from the cutoff he does open a bit, and from the bottom as well. This is kind of the same principle as last time. In a 3-bet pot, I'm definitely gonna be not excited to see bet on this flop, especially with my bare aces and stuff like that. Not that I'm 3-betting like rainbow aces here, but I still have just like ace 5-7. It could have been even double suited pre-flop with diamonds and spades, and I don't necessarily want to bet fold this flop, so I might decide to check here. So I go for a check raise here, and he checks back. Again, this is a board I'm still definitely gonna hit with a decent part of my 3-betting range. But I will check some of it. Like, even if I have bare ace king queen, I might decide to check, probably to check call. It's one of those weird hands that I think play kind of good by check calling instead of just bet folding, or definitely not check raising. So I definitely have a checking range on this flop, and not always giving up, but often I am. So it's important to have a check raising range. Kind of the same goes for this turn. I could definitely just lead here for protection. I definitely don't think Owl has any 2-pair or set, well, on the flop at least. So anyway, if I bet here and he shoves, I have somewhat of a crying call. I think he's gonna have a straight decent amount of time. Makes sense for him to check back a bare queen 9 type hand, or even a 9-7 type hand. Also, if I bet, I think he's just gonna never put me on air when I bet this turn, because the board just got worse. So if I want to maintain the idea that I was checking to check fold on the flop, then this turn probably just got worse for me, and so I checked again, and if he wants to check back and give me a free card, then I'm gonna be just getting a ton of free cards on like the most dangerous or worst boards ever, with my 3-betting range out of position, so that would be fine by me. So it kind of forces him to bet. He pots it, so not really that happy about it, but I still have to go ahead with my plan, as he might just be potting it with just blockers or something. So I shove, and he calls, and I actually think he tilt called or something, because he got it in pretty bad here with 27% equity. And I guess that's another benefit of playing the hand like I did, but obviously this just doesn't happen that often. I do hold up. But yeah, the main idea is on the turn here, even after the missed check raise on the flop, it still does work pretty good to go for another check raise. And if he checks back, then if you have bare ace king queen or bare king king 7 on this spot and he checks back, then that's a huge win for you probably. The other thing is, he should probably not bet pot here. I mean, he doesn't really have to. He can bet just like $8, and it's not like I'm gonna be able to, like, he might just widen my turn check calling range, and then he can bump the river on a bunch of river cards, and I'm gonna have to fold a lot. So I don't know, like betting the pot here is kind of falling for the trap of me check raising or check folding. And if he bets some weird amount, then I might have to check call, or I might just check fold for a much cheaper price for him, and he doesn't really commit himself with weak draws like that. So yeah, I definitely think misplayed there. Alright, so two hands left, so I'm gonna go through them a bit quicker. I 3-bet Newman. We're deep, 180 BBs deep to start the hand. So I'm 3-betting this hand, and I'm definitely just widening my 3-betting range as we get deeper, because there's not much people can do about it out of position. We hit top 2 pair, and I bet, and he check raises. So not really a spot I'm in love with pair top 2 pair. It's kind of sucks that our sidecars are not helping at all. I have a 1 backdoor flush draw, and I guess some backdoor straight draws, but other than that, you know, I would much rather them be overcards or give us a gutter. So yeah, with our specific hand, I think there's, well, let's talk a little bit about his check raising range. On this board texture, I definitely don't think, since it's wet and heavy, I definitely don't think he's just check raising really light at all. I mean, the lightest draw I could ever imagine him check raising here would be, well, he could have some like really light, not flush draws, but that's not a weak draw at all, obviously. The worst draw would probably be like Jack 9-8 with a club draw, and I don't think he even check raises that. He might lead or check call with it sometimes. I don't know. Depends on his mood, I guess. He's definitely pretty aggressive. So yeah, anyway, I think most of his flop check raising range has a flush draw in it, simply because of how the board texture is and the fact that I have blockers to, you know, top set and middle set and top 2. So I ran some simulations against his range, and I'm basically flipping, you know, that including hands like Queen 10 and a set of queens, 10s, and even 5s, I guess. And just a bunch of not flush draw type hands with gutters, or, you know, wraps with pair and stuff. Just flipping against your range might be a bit of a dog, so I think getting in on the flop is, you know, it's probably not minus EV, but I think it's way better to just call on the flop. This would be especially true if we were even deeper, but even with, you know, 96 behind, I think I can make a correct fold on a flush card. I don't think he's ever gonna shove a flush card without having a flush or a set. So either case, I'm definitely not getting us to call on a turn. And I guess I do have 4 outs to a boat up, and he would probably misplay his hand when I do, because he would try to rep the set himself when he has a flush draw. But yeah, overall I think the difference between just getting in on the flop and waiting for the turn and folding on a flush card is probably worth, you know, at least something. So that's the way I chose to play it. The main problem would arise if the turn is like 9, Jack, King, or Ace and he shoves. Although honestly my flop calling range after he check